was looking at the chart on that.
My name is Gus. I'm one of the artist president here at Delfina right now. I'm also a lecturer in high school. So I actually have maybe 2 points that are, there's a question in there somewhere, but also maybe it's just a comment you can respond to how you'd like it. I've worked around surveillance for a number of years, dealing with biometrics, and I often, through this work, think a lot about how, how can artists engage with these topics of emerging surveillance, and also people doing, intellectual work in the humanities, maybe critical theory, or what would be also the kind of conceptual intervention as well. So I guess I have comments divided into 2 areas, and one would be the problem of conceptualizing surveillance in the historical present. So, right, there are a lot of words that are commonly evoked to describe surveillance, such as privacy, and right, Big Brother as well. And so one of the things I'm wondering is, how could we push or reconfigure or maybe intervene into this conceptual terrain of these words? Because, of course, right, surveillance is, it means seeing from above, and this has been critiqued in a lot of recent surveillance studies literature, but that term in and of itself maybe not actually be kind of the best term to actually use to talk about what we use surveillance to talk about. So, and then also by possibly shifting and twisting and arranging these words, or conceptually intervening into this terrain, it can potentially, affect how people are in the know or not in the know, or also how it might effectively draw certain people into the conversation. So I've done a lot of work around the idea of opacity, and I've dealt with this work in a number of different countries, and I've talked through a lot of different ways you could, kind of talk about or imagine privacy, whether it's obfuscation, maybe like exodus from the autonomous Marxist tradition, and different ways to kind of talk about what that means will effectively move and motivate people in different ways. And also, I'm wondering about, how does privacy link up to different, maybe radical political desires that don't necessarily, immediately kind of funnel towards engaging in technology. So, how would maybe someone who's invested in moving towards communism, how does privacy, kind of fit in with that logic? Or we want to think about that relation in a different way. So yeah, this is just a general question about the way this gets conceptualized and sticking with the words that are already at play. And I guess the second point, which I think Gus brought up really well in his talk, is the problem of representation. And this, I guess there's 2 ways that I'm imagining, or I see artists primarily engaging with surveillance, and one is attempting to kind of visualize the problem, and maybe you see this in Trevor Paglin's work when he's going and photographing different surveillance sites, or the other side would be ways to escape or ways to evade surveillance. So you can see this in Adam Harvey's work with his privacy gift shop, where he's developing a line of fashion accessories to try and evade certain surveillance devices. And I feel like a lot of this artwork is really striking to me because it never often poses just a kind of simple technological fix. Often a lot of this artwork, especially on the side when it's posing alternatives to evade surveillance, it only kind of works maybe in a very limited practical way and is often more conceptual. But often that kind of conceptual opening, I think, makes a space for possibly developing a new myth, right? Marianne, you brought up Donna Haraway and the cyborg, which I just taught on Tuesday, and the whole part about the cyborg, right, is about actually making a new myth to understand that moment, that confluence of feminism and technology. So yeah, one of the things I like to think about with this with the artistic work around surveillance is actually attempting to also tell some kind of different myth, right, that's connected to social reality, but also moves into this realm of fiction, right, where it's not necessarily bound by these kind of words that I was just talking about that are always kind of at play with surveillance and privacy. And okay, sorry, that was a little disorganized, but that's what I tried.
Cool, thanks so much. Cool. Are we going to hear from Marianne straight away, or should we? Yeah, great.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm one of the artists in residence here at Delfina Foundation. I'm also a lecturer at Harvard University. Thanks for that panel. I think that one of the things that has concerned me in thinking about surveillance is maybe too much of a reliance on a kind of almost like the way we approached international relations like in the 90s, like this sort of purely sociological approach to it rather than something which I think we're attempting now, which is a more diffuse approach. And one way that I've come to these questions myself is partially through philology, comparative literature, as well as visual art. I think one of the first words that I heard that pricked my ears was security, and how like nauseating that word can be, and sort of like roll our eyes when we hear it because we're knocked over the head with it so much. But security is actually a really relevant term to this discussion on surveillance, I think. Its etymological root reaches back to sinecura, or without care. So the idea of sinecure, or care, or security rather, is that you are without care. You're sine cura because something outside cares for you, right? The state cares for you. Global capitalism in some way cares about you, right? Cares about you. The police care for you, and therefore you are without care. And I think this question of participation, which was the other word that kind of pricked my ears up, is the fear, and I say this like as a user of these these mediums, that you're being cared for with or without your consent. I think one thing I really related to in the discussion you guys brought forward was the idea of whether one can take part in the public domain, right? Because there's something historically very tangible about this idea of being without care and having the state and the police and others care in your place. Rather now, I think what's maybe different and what's so the break, right, when we see a quote from Virginia Woolf about being able to submerge herself, is that to be able to be among Virginia Woolf's cohort is almost like impossible. Like it's not just about being submerging yourself as an artist, but as there's no such thing as like the proverbial going off into like the cave, right? There's almost no such thing because there's a tacit participation that we're always already in. And so I wonder if this question of care and sine cura, or being without care and being cared for in the most like passive sense, to go to what Gus was saying about like a more, I would say ambivalent, but possibly positive future or futurity, is whether one can conceive of how we might care, how we might wrestle back care. Again, I say ambivalence because I think every time I've seen these technologies, I'm going to use the example of Twitter in a second, but every time I've seen these technologies birthed or used in a kind of radical or alternative or possibly anti-capitalist way and so on, they've been reappropriated and then yet again diffused and appropriated again, right? And on and on and on. So I have a kind of ambivalent position about that. But I was around in the Republican National Convention in 2008 in the States when a technology called text mob, TXT mob, was first used. And it was kind of before the text messages, or around the time of text messaging, and way before like iMessage. And text mob was a way to use a kind of like intranet to connect activists to each other to supersede law enforcement surveillance of cell phones. So you could potentially say, hey, there's a Republican candidate that's about to come to X hotel. We should all go to that hotel and confront or create an encounter or situation. And that actually is the predecessor to Twitter. Like the persons that worked on text mob are now either erased out of the history of Twitter, or some of them are, like have like blue chip options within Twitter or whatever. But those coders and programmers are actually anti-capitalist activists who helped create this technology. But when you're a user of Twitter and whether you tacitly participate or actively participate, there's a sense that, you know, you are working for the corporation, right? And like that sense of removal, and then perhaps reappropriating it for your own uses as you can, and like moving back and forth between these registers. So I think, again, I want to like pose this question of how one can contend with being cared for in the passive tense by what we think of as these unrepresentable powers, right? Like the police, not just as people with uniforms, but a kind of like almost like invisible force that we're always aware of as either reading or knowing or watching. And again, how we might wrestle that back and how we might invigorate it with a sense of caring or securing ourselves in a more active and possibly more radical way. Thanks.
Wow. That was incredible. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Honestly, after that, I feel I really Okay, I'm going to try and pick up on a couple of things. First, looking at what Zach was talking about, the surveillance, this notion of seeing from above, and the problems people have with that concept. I'm going to kick it over to you guys and maybe ask you, the way I see this and what brought me into this field in the first place was I fundamentally thought this was about the citizen versus the state. And what was happening was the state was becoming so much more empowered versus citizens, you know, its ability to surveil and control and manage information. And that clearly, you know, that's been something that's been happening. This state has been a lot more in our lives since the welfare state after the war. This has been, you know, there sort of was a high point of the state, and it's somewhat withdrawing from public support, and yet private surveillance is coming up more. But then I was thinking, as I was listening to you guys, maybe part of why, you know, the more we learn about surveillance, the more powerful we see that states are, and yet the less powerful we feel as individuals to do anything about it. And maybe that's because we're thinking about this entirely wrongly. This conceptualization of surveillance as the citizen versus the state. Well, I mean, no wonder we feel outnumbered because there's just one citizen versus the whole state. So I guess, so thoughts, what are your thoughts on this, you know, this rolling notion of the state, the citizen, the surveillance, and it changing the relationship between those two fundamental pieces of the political unit? Gus was doing a lot of nodding, so I'm...
Yeah, no, and I struggle with language, and that's why I love those interventions, and I love what you're trying to say there. Like, I am the state, and so I should have a say over it. That's an old democratic way of looking at it. But also, I actually want to reduce the size of the state. I'm not a Republican by any means, but let's not presume that there is this incredible, all-seeing, all-controlling power that is called the state. The state is many things, and the state hates itself. It will eat, like, departments will eat each other up. What we found in Colombia when we were investigating the surveillance apparatus in Colombia was that we found there were about 4 different government agencies competing to buy in technology they didn't know how to use. But they wanted to be the center of power because that's what they thought represented power today. And same in the UK, when they wanted to have an ID card in this country a few years ago. One of the things that killed it, on top of the conceptualization of cost and uselessness, was the fact that the government department that wanted to run the ID card wanted to do so because it wanted to accumulate power within government, and the rest of government hated that department. It just so happens it's around the corner, the Home Office. And that's where you see, it's not this grand notion of state versus the individual. And then I would also take the security point, which is fascinating. And I think we need to reconceptualize security in 2 ways based on that contribution. First, the way you ended your contribution about being cared for so you don't have to care. You know, I think about that a lot when it comes to the food I eat or where I go or the environment. There are so many things in my life where I don't know if it's safe or I don't know if it's good, but I know that there is somebody out there who's going to say something if something is wrong. There's an environmental group that will identify a practice that's wrong. There's a child protection group that will identify a school that's dangerous. It's not just the state, and it's not just law enforcement. We just presume that there's all these things there to take care of us. And so when you throw security in that light, there are many securities. And the reason I'm optimistic about the future is because the state security as a notion is starting to fall apart, because what they want in the end of the day is probably a very small number of people that who make these decisions. What they want is incompatible with what other arms of government want, what industry wants, what we want, and what a variety of other powerful institutions want. And so they're no longer, apart from the rhetoric, they're no longer going to be able to own the term security. That's my feeling.
I want to come back to some of what Marianne and Mona Lisa was talking about, but in the meantime, we talked a little bit when we prepared this about this notion of security versus privacy, and I wondered would either Joss or Marianne, perhaps Joss, I think, step up to the plate, because this is one of those political media narratives that we hear a lot of, and that is very problematic, and yet it's hard for people to pull it apart and say, why are these things always in mutual opposition to each other?
Wow, I get that one. Well, I mean, and feel free to jump in, because I know that we were all having so much fun with this before the panel started. But I mean, this is obviously one of the sort of fundamental dichotomies that is held up. And in a sense, if we're talking about the language that is continually being used, we're also not just talking about the individual terminologies. We're talking about the frames of debate that are always held up in the same place. And the privacy versus security debate is one of the classic misleading, to my mind, misleading debates in this area. Ultimately, when we consider privacy in the terms of how it was discussed for a lot of this, a lot of the presentations that were given, we're largely talking about sort of autonomy and freedom of action and freedom of expression. By and large, you can understand why the expression is that freedom of action, freedom of expression, freedom to act without observation or surveillance is freedom to do bad stuff. And this is the debate that is going on against security. In general, though, the argument I would make is it comes down to exactly what Gus just said. There are so many different kinds of security. There are so many different conceptualizations of what security means that we end up with this overarching debate that just says security is this protean concept that we can use to argue against any particular policy or implementation or technology or individual action or movement that we dislike. I see the relative risks of free action that are enabled by privacy and the ability to move without observation to be an acceptable trade-off against any of the various risks that can be thrown up. And I view the ability of privacy to allow society to develop, allow communities within our society to express themselves in a certain way as a way of enabling security for those societies. We've got to remember that privacy and the ability to act without being observed is something that is enabling privacy for security for people. We get security through the ability to, for example, vote without our votes being recorded, this fundamental tenet of democracy. We get, historically, the ability of communities, the homosexual community, for example, to act outside of the observation of society at large and the state, so that community can develop into a movement that can then start to shift society in the direction that maybe we want to see. One thing I did want to say about that ties into this about the previous question is that this conceptualization of privacy and surveillance as being between the state and the individual, it's interesting that you say that that's where you came from with that, because I probably read too many William Gibson novels when I was growing up, but for me the fundamental sort of differentiation has always been between large institutions and individuals. Not from a classical libertarian point of view, but I don't make a huge distinction between the state and the large corporation in that sense. When I'm concerned about privacy rights, when I'm concerned about who is watching what we are doing, I don't by default consider the state as my actor to oppose. I consider anyone who has access to that data flow and wants to exploit it for their purposes, and largely that is about controlling my ability to develop and act as an individual without being affected by that conception. So,
yeah, citizen versus the state, netizen versus the corporation. I agree with Gus. States are a complete mess. Their departments are competing with each other. There are electoral cycles. There are personalities. It's a lot more chaotic than I'm led to believe. However, a corporation has something called the bottom line, and they're very efficient. Sometimes they're not so efficient as they think they are. But in terms of levels of efficiency of state surveillance is one thing, but corporate funded surveillance is another, and they are in fact, if you keep the spectrum going around, they're going to loop around and actually start being the same. And empirically they are, because a lot of what Snowden's files revealed and everything that happened before Snowden is about what we call public-private partnerships. Governments have allowed a public service internet to evolve in many ways, in ways that they couldn't have done themselves, but the trade-off has been by private money. So we found ourselves, some of us, like me, who's not particularly a fan of the nanny state, but it's not a massive libertarian either, you find yourself, if you're thinking as an activist advocacy situation, and here I defer to Gus, but in my own sort of little way, I think I'm finding myself having to defend governments in ways I would never have dreamed of. It's just horrendous, because, I'm no fan of some of the things that have been going on. So this is the questions you've addressed to us. Are we speaking to you back? Are we speaking here as artists, as activists, as scholars, as ordinary citizens, as techies? It's a very difficult conversation. So I just want to answer very quickly. The agency that Gus has brought into the conversation is very important. That there is agency and there are alternatives, and there's so many gaps where these tools don't work, become redundant, whatever. So the real issue is that there's a huge battle for the narrative. So this issue about how we represent and counter-represent the hegemonic narrative that's developing, and some very clever promotional PR marketing people on this job at the corporate level doing incredibly good work at controlling and manipulating and derailing the narrative. And there are also equivalent people doing great work for government departments like the Home Office. Maybe.
That one person.
Yeah. Attempting to sort of come up with the security narrative. So you have to understand it as a narrative. These are not absolutes. Once you understand this is just a great big myth-making machinery, things look a little less dismal. So agency narratives, but also artists, I think. To me, why Simon Denny's work is interesting is he's not trying to be literal in the sense a lot of us. He's being literal in one sense, but not in the way we understand it. He's trying to get at the way these devices and these practices and these power dynamics, which are mediated and facilitated through these particular sorts of technologies, which are hardware and software, have a psycho-emotional and a pedagogical dimension to it. So you don't have to literally spell it out. You can get at it by other ways, and that's where artists can do things. You don't necessarily have to use a computer screen to talk about computers. So that's your challenge for us, and I think those that are more successful are taking on the older idioms and the older materials to talk about very contemporary issues. And some artists are using very contemporary materials to talk about some very old issues. So really the sky's the limit as far as artists are concerned. Security can be nauseating, particularly when someone decides to take care of it you don't really want them to. But there are alternative understandings of security, going back to Anne Tickner's rewriting of the security narrative within international relations theory as an inclusive notion. Derrida's trying to talk through it through the point of absolute hospitality. And of course people like Carol Gilligan talking about ethics of care. The fact that security has become nauseating and oppressive is not because security itself necessarily needs to be. It's because it's about the inherent power struggles that are going on, about who pays for it and whose security. So, to be continued.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this notion Mona Lisa brought up about the weakness of the sociological approach to security. That terrifies me because that's the only approach I've ever had. But you're absolutely right. I was musing earlier to Gus and saying to him, is there also something about how we relate to the way, the way you broke down the term security as the notion of care, and somebody is caring for you, this paternalistic notion almost. Is there also something almost narcissistic about, the fact that nothing I do is insignificant? CCTV cameras follow me everywhere I go. My tracking device tells people where I've been. There's no such thing as a sound of one device clapping anymore, because everything we do is tracked and is watched and surveilled. And in some sense, we'll never ever be alone again. I mean, I wonder, has that got some kind of emotional appeal to us? When I went to this Ai Weiwei exhibition a couple of days ago, there's one moment where he recreates the room he was kept in for 81 days. And it's pretty shockingly claustrophobic. It's horrible. You can actually almost, you feel that it's smelly, but it's not. It's a very strange experience. But one of the things that struck me was he said he was the state was so concerned, and I am sorry, I pull myself away from that, but so concerned about his physical person and his physical well-being. They had a doctor examine him at least every day. In fact, sometimes 7 times a day. To see that he was healthy, but also to, I don't know what, to like crush him back down into his physical person. To say, you as an individual or as a creative or as a person, you it's really your physical person that the state has control of. Anyway, I thought that was a fascinating idea. Look, I'd like to kick this open to, we've got some fantastic people in the audience here, and I'm sure you've got loads of questions. So, would either Zach or Mary Mona Lisa like to come back on anything, or after that maybe we could just open it up to questions? No. Okay. Hands in the air. Who's got some questions? One up here in the front.
Yeah, I'm just following up on something that Josh said. Was just, I kind of found the whole kind of distinction between the corporation and the nation a little bit naive. I wondered if you consider that a little bit. Now, there's 2 ways of looking at that. One would be like that these kind of Googles and Facebooks can actually just radically change systems of law themselves. Like they can change the norms of privacy without having to go to a court or having to put a vote. I think that's just an amazing power they have. And then just looking at more in a context of empire and network capitalism, where these guys are just intrinsically linked and there's no separation between them, really. And I just think there's some separation between Google, Facebook and, say, governmental agencies of network capital and the big players is just a naive concept, a naive idea. I'd like to see what you think about that.
Just, is it that simple?
Well, I mean, I think the point about democratic sort of oversight in that sense is key here, and I think one of the things that terrifies me, particularly when I see Facebook and Google and some of the sort of more recent developments that they make, is that they have started to address these problems at more than a pure engineering term. I mean, you mentioned they can change policies, they can change approaches to privacy. We see changes occurring in how Facebook treats privacy. We've seen in the last few days, Facebook have just put out a notice saying we're going to change the search settings, so now all your previous posts are included in search. You need to be aware of this. They've changed by default the way that the system works, and the response has not been, and we're going to set your privacy settings to be to reduce this capability by default. We're going to say we're going to make you aware of it, and if you choose to do something about it, if you actively choose to do that, then you can do something about it. But I think what terrifies me is the growing realization that they have that this is a power that they can expressly use and explicitly use, because, like I say, for a lot of the development of the internet, one of the criticisms I would have made is that the technological and engineering decisions were all there was. There was no conception that there was a political dimension or a sociological dimension or a psychological dimension in the technologies or the platforms or the services that were being developed. And that was a huge problem, because you were baking in these rights and norms into the technology. But when we get to the situation where the relationship between the citizens of Facebook, in that sense, and the corporation that is managing them is this purely pseudo-voluntary relationship, where they sort of say, well, if you don't like it, you can always leave the service. We get this. You get this situation where these decisions can be made that can affect global society, far going beyond national borders and the effects that individual nation states can have, and you can change the affordances of how people relate to each other, the ability of people to communicate, the ability of people to relate to each other, and how they do it by that naive abstracted formalization of relationships. In the more sort of specific case of, states being separate from corporations and the amount of links between them, then obviously any state that has that sort of relates to that power, of course there's going to be a relationship between corporations and states in that sense. And I think then again, to some sense, that is a bidirectional relationship in that Google spends a large amount of money on lobbying because they want to change the way that the regulation is put forward to allow them to function effectively as a business. But this comes back to what Gus says. The state is lots of competing empires. I mean, if you ask me to name the one privacy technology, specific privacy technology that's out there, I would say Tor, the anonymous web browsing system that allows you to browse the web anonymously. Who originally designed and developed that was the US State Department, and they still fund large amounts of it. Now, the people that developed it were, as hardcore hacker libertarian as you could ask for, but the funding is still coming from the State Department. The motivation behind it was still developed at the US Naval Research Laboratories. So we have this contest within the states, we've got this contest between the states and the corporations, and at the same time we've just got power structures sort of embedded in the way that we do things.
If I can just add to that and presume that I agree with everything that's been said, so don't think that I'm trying to argue a different view. But let's not forget that companies are full of failure as well. Google has failed more times to introduce surveillance into their products than they have succeeded. They've had to shut down so many unsuccessful business models because people didn't want it. People rejected it, or they got in so much trouble they had to shut it down. And the same thing happened with Facebook. So it's not this natural rolling towards them just becoming all-knowing, all-controlling, all-powerful. It just so happens it happens a lot, but it's not necessarily that way. But to counter what I just said also, we often see the rise of companies who become powerful and try to prevent other companies from coming up. The AT&Ts, the BTs, or the oil companies and the Robert Barons of the 1800s and whatnot. What worries me about the current environment is that these companies are filthy rich, and they can buy things now.
Like Boston Dynamics.
Like what?
Like the robot company.
Exactly. Absolutely. And so Google's reorganization to Alphabet is a sign of the times. Like Google may not be able to innovate anymore because they have so many failed products, and they realize that they're only good at one thing, but they will start buying. And then there's a new fiefdom, and there's a new state to worry about that doesn't have any of those controls. And so, yeah, I do agree in that sense.
And I guess I was kind of seeing Google and Facebook's role as being kind of looking at it kind of at a more abstracted and holistic level, that they're kind of facilitators of accelerated network capitalism, because they facilitate the movement through the highways, the information highways, to use an old 90s, early 90s term. So, they're so hand in hand with governments and whatever, the different groupings within nations that want to keep network capitalism going, because they're the tools that keep everyone driving and going faster and faster and getting used to passing information around quicker and quicker and within each other, and create relationships of exchange and network exchange between each other. So that's what I guess is how you can't separate Google and Facebook from the state so much as well. It's such a driver of network capitalism.
Exactly, and fundamentally, this is what Apple's trying to disrupt a little bit of that, and it's come down from the board level apparently, but they're trying to innovate in a different way that doesn't allow Google and Facebook to be the center of all of our interactions. And so if you compare, stop me if I'm going off on one, but if you compare Google now, which is this idea that your phone and your computers will centralize all their information at Google servers. And so Google will know that I need to go home after this. It knows where I live. It knows the weather. It knows where the buses are. Google can determine the best route for me to get home. But in order for that to happen, Google needs to possess all that information. So they want me to like Google now, so I'll put more of my information within Google's reaches. Apple's trying something in their latest version of their operating system, which is still being trying to prove as a concept, which is keep the information on your device. Let your device operating system read your calendar, make sense of your calendar, and know, okay, this event ends at 8:30. It knows what I consider home for my contact book, and the device itself will start to do what Google now is trying to do, but without sending that information to Apple, without sending that information to that fiefdom that can control. It won't work as well. That's the problem. And from an engineering perspective, Apple's product will never be as good as Google's product. But they're taking a gamble to say people do want, they pay a lot for these fancy devices. I pay pocketloads for this fancy device. And we want to have control, and we don't want to have to be intermediated by these other companies, but we want to be intermediated by these nice
So I want
interfaces.
Jocelyn and Marianne to come in.
So I just wanted to respond to that, which is, I mean, it's a wonderful model in itself, because this is what, certainly in the privacy technologies field, we've been calling for a long time, which is the idea that, keep as much of that data on the device as possible, allow the processing to go there. But if we think about moving forward to the world that came up in several of the presentations, which is the decentralized device and the lack of view of the individual as the owner and holder of the device, that's certainly going to work fine for the phone that you've got in your pocket. But when you're moving through a ubiquitous sensing, monitoring environment, that's something that you never have that control in the first place. And to ask for that to be localized, one of the major projects I work on at the moment is about privacy in robotics. We have some little robotic devices, the Now robots, that we've been working on, looking at how they interact with humans, the way that humans sort of can correspond through the robotic interface, through the avatar of the robot. But when I started looking at this project purely from the privacy angle, which was my role on the project, I very quickly realized that there aren't really any specific privacy problems with robots. There are privacy problems with computers. There are privacy problems with information services that we interact with. And by and large, a robot, in any sense that we're likely to interact with it, is going to be an instantiation of a service that is running somewhere else. And that's when, that robot isn't necessarily going to be a device I own. It could well be, but by and large, these things are working through analytics platforms, through data storage platforms, through processing platforms. And as the robotics element sort of disappears from needing this physical presence into the walls, the sensors in the floor and in the air and in the light bulbs, there's never that chance to have your data on a local device because the environment is just making it available.
Marianne?
I don't think we're being naive. I think we're being disingenuous. I think there's a difference. I get your point completely. However, if you look at it from a sort of like, where do we go to from here? There's a real kind of, I don't know. I think we're in a moment where, for instance, if you look at the international law level and the sort of geopolitical level, UN agencies and various intergovernmental organisations, they're all only just woken up and realise that the whole jurisprudence they've been working with for at least 100 years is completely behind the curve. Is it behind the curve? Behind the times. Totally just not what is actually happening out there technically and socially. Already enabled, already being facilitated by what people do, which devices they use or they do not use, okay? So there's a real kind of crisis of confidence almost for the lawyers, the judges, and the technocrats in Europe. Meanwhile, we have sort of, as I brought out, electoral cycles. We have governments, particularly the UK government, with a very particular program, based on a certain understanding of security, right? With a certain target. So it's going to enlist and enrol every technical means it can to get where it wants to go. Whether the next government does the same, I don't know. But the point is, in terms of how we research it or respond to it or articulate it even, we even have to change the way we talk about things, not just the way we depict things. And Rebecca McKinnon, who is very sort of quite well known from the US critical point of view, talks about the shift from state sovereigns to commercial sovereigns. And that in fact, de facto, it is true that these large corporations are taking decisions every day that normally not so long ago, government representatives officially took. But this is assuming that these informal networks and crazy decisions didn't happen before the internet. Of course they did. States and markets have been working hand in hand since forever. It's an ideological position to argue that you have bad states, good markets, or good states, bad markets. So we're in a sort of an ideological battle. And so for my point, let's bring in the China versus the US narrative at the moment. Bad China, good US. Chinese internet, censorship, no freedom of expression. Many of some of my Chinese students are here, Chinese citizens in the room, and previous students would tell you, they know this, at least they know. They know what's going down. They know that they can't talk in a certain way. There's a disconnect between what you know and what you don't know. So a lot of the time we're being disingenuous in the West, completely self-absorbed, self-satisfied, vain, deciding that somehow we have this perfectly operating model of democracy. I'd say it's in deep, deep crisis, and it is more than one it. There are many models of democracy in crisis. And the technology, I think, is perhaps simply showing us, in many ways, things that governments have always wanted to do can now be done. Trouble is, governments no longer own the narrative. They no longer own the technology. They don't own the intellectual property rights. They are registered in Geneva, owned and controlled by large private corporations. And governments have suddenly woken up after 25 years of free market ideology and orthodoxy and said, oh, hang on a minute. International law says that we, at the end of the day, we will take care of your human rights. Oh, well, I can't say I'm convinced. So I feel that's where the work has to be done as well. Both corporations and government. It's not an either or, and don't let anyone try and persuade you that it is. It's both. And as Donna Haraway, my heroine, always reminds us, the cyborg metaphor was a powerful, empowering myth, but back in a very different era. Even then, Haraway understood what she called the informatics of domination. Her point is, the thing is to try and figure out what the difference is. So it's about understanding the difference, if I can sort of put it up on an abstract level. We have to get rid of these old either-or narratives. We're in a whole different era. The technology is showing us this.
Yeah, question there.
Hi, thank you very much for your wonderful talks. I guess my question, it's sort of a comment/question to Gus and Marianne, because I think a lot of the framing here of surveillance was very negative and very grim. But I think that we also experience it in a very sort of fun way. So we have like reality TV, which is basically a form of surveillance. We have the whole celebrity fandom, people, spying on other people as a form of fun, and we have selfies and stuff like that. So I'm wondering how, as activists, you can, and I think a lot of people, when I talk to a lot of people, they actually say that, well, considering the price, that's the price they're willing to pay. So I'm just kind of wondering how, as activists, you manage to frame privacy as something that is too much of a high cost to pay in a way, or that people should actually care about it, when in their everyday practice, they actually enjoy surveillance in a way. So, yeah.
So that's a really good question. Okay, I'm gonna take that and parse it a little bit before I throw it to you guys, because in the free market economy we have share trading in companies, and the economic and financial theories basically says all information that can and will be known about a company is currently priced into its share price. That is, the share price is the expression of everything we can or should know about this company, and it tells us. So, do you think that we know what the share price is of our individual privacy? Have we priced in all of the potential upsides and downsides of it when we are doing this quote-unquote trade-off?
Stratospheric.
Go ahead.
No, that was it. Go ahead.
I don't buy anything you've said, and I see why you say it. First of all, the reality TV narrative has existed for quite a while, but people don't watch it as much anymore, and so it's just not that interesting a narrative. It was when it first came out, Big Brother. Oh my God, they called it Big Brother. Everybody's watching, then people stopped watching it, and so it's not as compelling. A selfie isn't a form of surveillance; it's a form of expression. And let's be careful what we call surveillance. And I even have to find myself in the same way you're defending governments. I have to defend companies from time to time. Facebook isn't conducting surveillance. Like, they genuinely are trying to get people to communicate together. And they're not selling your information. It's not that you are the product or anything like that. These are the narratives that people have created, and it destroys our ability to represent the world and find the solutions to the world. That's why I'm a little aggressive to your articulation.
My PhD will prove you otherwise, but it's
And all two people who read your PhD will believe you.
several books are claiming that, but it's
But
fine.
the point is, Facebook doesn't sell you, they sell access to you. They don't sell your personal information. They sell, based on what they know about you, they sell advertisers the ability to get access to you. That's how they make money. And it's a very different model of surveillance. That's a very different model of selling you. So that's why I want to be a little bit more nuanced about surveillance in that context, and about the idea of how what are you worth. It's not that. It's they make their money the way that TV stations used to make money. It's like, we know the kind of people who watch this show, and you as this company want to have access to that, so you pay. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not going to get worse. It doesn't mean we're not going to monetize people on their data and do all the dark things that we've painted already, which is why I have to fight back against this painting, because it reduces people's expectations. They think, oh, I'm just a product already, so, oh, well, I might as well accept it. And I fight back to say, that's not how it is. It's not that bad, and it doesn't have to be that bad, and it's going to get better.
Yeah, I think I kind of get where you're coming from there, Gus. I mean, you do get caught between defending something that normally you wouldn't wake up defending. The thing about be careful what you call surveillance, because surveillance is a term that comes out of that kind of Big Brother statist narrative, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the idea of turning things into fun and realising that there's a whole shiny side to this that we enjoy. I get your point there, Eleanor, and that's really, really an important point from a tactical point of view, how to create sort of platforms where you can get people to rethink about what they're doing automatically. But I just think the monitoring, Gus, even though they're selling us, I think just for a moment I'd like to call that surveillance, what Facebook's doing, just to sort of get us out of this these kinds of rigid
But that is the
black box
rigidity. You're
terms.
introducing a black box of, it's this
But
amorphous, massive
I'm
concept.
transferring it across out of its usual domain into another domain to shake it up a little bit.
I think what we're
That's
actually
all. I
doing,
want to get to.
we're acting out Joss's notion that we don't that we find it really difficult to even conceive of information that we're giving away. We don't even know how to think about it.
I mean, I think the main problem I have with the conceptualization of surveillance as fun and Big Brother in this sense is that those were entirely consenting relationships. You know, that was, people chose to go onto Big Brother. They knew to some extent, or to a far greater extent than we understand what Facebook are going to do with our data. People who enter into reality TV have a far greater understanding of what they're getting for, and the benefits to them are far clearer. I think at the same time, yeah, of course in some sense, of course, it's fun, because this is the whole basis of. It's entertainment, but it comes down to, this is exactly the same narrative that frames conspiracy theories. It allows you some level of control over the institution or the organisation, because you have a clear enemy, you have a clear basis, you have a clear understanding of how the world works. You know that you can do things and you can affect things in that sense. And I think that what's much more real and much more sort of disturbing is the fact that most of those structures that we see. You know, I mean, the flip side of the Big Brother is this current series. Is it called Hunted, where people are trying to avoid being. You know, can you survive? Can you manage to avoid the surveillance state? You know, you could use that to make a flip side of an argument, but I don't think you should. I think they both play into the same one, which is you are clearly defining actor and adversary and watching the interplay between them as entertainment, and that's entirely an informed, consenting, risk-free version of this surveillance state that's being played into here. I think what's disturbing is when we realise we're in the real world, possibly, where it's far more complex. We don't have a full understanding. There are factors that affect the decisions that are affecting us that are completely outside of our control and our knowledge, and they're outside of anyone's control and knowledge, because Facebook, much like the state, is not a monolithic entity making rational decisions. It's people in places implementing stuff. They make mistakes. They think, oh, this would be a cool idea, and that gets turned into what happens. The disturbing side is that we have to live in that chaotic, sort of vulnerable position in that world, and that's why I think there's a huge difference between the consenting version of Big Brother, but this comes back to something from I forget which one of the earlier presentations, where we talk about consent. You know, are we consenting to Facebook to have our data processed, analysed, monetised? The answer is, in one sense, of course we are. But when you look into, when you do experiments with people, the term is not consent, it's informed consent. And can we have informed consent about something that is so complex and so beyond our ability or anyone's ability to understand? And I would say almost intrinsically no, there is no such notion of informed consent when you're talking about sharing your data with a company that doesn't even know what it's going to do with it at this point. That's where I sit in that debate.
So wrapping things up then, let me see, do I ask you another question? Probably not. Jane is making the wrapping things up universal sign for that. Final comments. I mean, one of the there are a couple of things. There have been so many fantastic sound bites that have come out of this. I'm going to give you a few of them back. Surveillance is watching with intent. Very good. Marianne, top marks. We're looking at the everydayization of surveillance. Another good one. We simply don't know how to conceive of our own data and its multiplicity of uses. So much good stuff. No, that was one of mine. No.
Hey, take some.
Also, how hackneyed our visualization of these things is, and it's sort of stymieing us from thinking more, in a less kind of rigid way about this. Gus is optimistic about the future. I'm kind of pessimistic. When I think about what I'm doing in this field, I sort of hope I'm holding back the floods for maybe 5 years until everyone else catches up and we've still got some democracy left. I'm sort of pessimistic. So I guess final words from people. Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Where do you think we're going with this? Gus, do you want to?
Well, you already know. I am optimistic because of some of the issues that were raised here by the panelists, but also from the audience, where nothing's monolithic and there's no simple narrative. And all the competing narratives we've had throughout time still exist today. And so the notion of security is different from Apple versus engineers in Google versus the marketing teams in Google versus GCHQ versus the Met Police versus the shelter down the street. These are all different versions of security, and they are always going to compete. And ultimately, the encompassing, all-seeing eye just can't exist within a more empowered, technologically empowered, fractured notion of security.
Thanks, Gus. Marianne?
Well, I'll just go back to Antonio Gramsci, because if he'd been on Twitter, this is what he would have tweeted. It's about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the spirit, or the optimism of the will. So I'm going to be pessimistic intellectually and optimistic in terms of my own agency and hopefully collaborations with these wonderful people, on and on. But I think we've come to a watershed moment, so I would go to side with Gus. Optimism, but you've got to work at it. It's not automatic or automated. You got to work at it.
Thank you, Marianne. Joss?
I used to be hugely pessimistic. I think you should be pessimistic if you expect society to look anything like it's looked in the past 100 years or 20 years or 10 years. I think my optimism in this sense, and I hate the fact that the whole panel's gone optimistic.
Not entirely.
But ultimately optimistic, but in a sense of, I feel that we're starting to get to a stage where we're starting to understand some of the implications of these technologies. They're too chaotic and too complex to understand where they're going to go. The internet was not designed to be how it is. It became this amazing system purely by accident, and that's why it's so badly working by and large. But I think we at least are now in a situation where we're starting to say, we know that these decisions are going to have huge implications. We know that society is going to have to fundamentally change with the technologies that we are developing, and we're starting to be in a situation where we can at least start to make those decisions consciously and try and guide where we're going in a more conscious sense. So optimism from me as well.
Thank you. All right. Well, so on that note, something Marianne said just reminded me of that old IETF saying about the internet protocols. It's something like be a
rough consensus.
not rough consensus, no, but be generous about how much data you receive and be conservative about how much you
Be
transmit.
conservative in what you said. And
Yeah, I think those are words to live by. Listen, I want to thank you all for all the fantastic questions. Thanks to Jane and everyone for organising this, to Aaron for having us here, and thank you to our panellists, to Gus Hosein, to Marianne Franklin, and to Joss Wright, and good luck with this fantastic series of events. Thank you.
We look forward to seeing all the outcomes of your residencies. Seriously.
And thank you, to our artists, to Zach and Mona Lisa for those incredibly thoughtful and incisive comments. Thank you all.